Thanos needed the Infinity Gauntlet. Ultron needed global network access. The Chitauri needed an entire fleet and a portal punched through the sky over Manhattan. Lex Luthor needed a checkbook and a registered headquarters with a PR team. That is the gap. The terrifying, structural, embarrassing gap between the threats Marvel was built to detect and the threat Lex Luthor actually represents. He is not the biggest predator in this universe. He is the one that changes the ecosystem. He doesn't storm the gate. He enters through the bloodstream, and by the time the white blood cells arrive, he has already introduced himself as the immune system. If that sentence just made something in your brain fire differently, good. Subscribe. Because this is not a who wins the fight video. This is a how does he win without one video, and those are much harder to stop. Here is the opening image, the one that tells you everything about what kind of invasion this actually is. It is 3 weeks after an incident. You don't need to know which specific incident. In Marvel's world, there is always an incident. This one ends with 6 city blocks leveled, a casualty count read by anchors with the practiced neutrality of people who have read too many casualty counts, and a government press conference where 3 officials take turns explaining why the response timeline was what it was. The dust is still in the air when the headline drops. Not from S.H.I.E.L.D., not from the UN, from a press release. LexCorp International pledges $4 billion to reconstruction. No contracts, no naming rights, no political riders. Mobilized logistics network already positioned on site. The city's mayor reads it on his phone in the back of a car and closes his eyes for a moment that lasts a little too long. That expression, that involuntary, unguarded relief, is the first thing Lex Luthor purchases in the Marvel Universe. It costs him approximately nothing relative to what it buys. Now watch what Tony Stark does when he sees that same press release. He reads it twice. He runs the name through every database Friday has access to, cross-references the corporate filings, pulls the last 10 years of LexCorp's SEC equivalents, checks the logistics network's operational history, and sits in a chair for almost a full minute without saying anything. Then he says, he's real. Not a threat assessment, not a tactical evaluation, just that he's real. With the specific weight of a man who has spent his entire career assuming he was the most dangerous, brilliant person operating in this particular lane, and who has just been introduced to evidence that the lane is wider than he thought. Steve Rogers asks him what that means. Tony doesn't answer immediately. That pause, that uncharacteristic hesitation, is the first crack in the foundation. Lex didn't put it there, but he knew exactly where it would appear because he studied the foundation before he stepped onto it. This is not a story about a fight. This is a story about a method. It's about what happens when the most dangerous intelligence in the DC universe, not the strongest, not the most powerful, but the most patient, enters a world that has been training its threat detection systems to watch the sky and never learn to audit the boardroom. Lex Luthor doesn't bring kryptonite to Marvel. He doesn't need it. He brings something that Marvel's world is far more vulnerable to, a comprehensive understanding of how frightened institutions make decisions, wrapped in a philanthropic framework so legally clean, it takes a paralegal 70 hours a week across 11 months to find the first thread worth pulling. This video is about those 11 months, about the Stark problem, the mutant problem, and the Doom problem, about the people who were right too early and the systems that made being right too early functionally identical to being wrong. The day Lex Luthor arrived in the Marvel Universe, he didn't attack the Avengers. He bought their problem. He showed up in the aftermath of a disaster that the heroes caused while stopping a larger disaster, and he handed the traumatized population something no cape had managed to provide. Not rescue, infrastructure. Not heroism, response time. The distinction is subtle enough that most people don't catch it in real time. The distinction is enormous enough that it changes everything. In a universe already drowning in catastrophe, he understood something with crystalline precision. You don't conquer a traumatized world with force. You conquer it with relief. And Marvel's cities had been traumatized so many times, rebuilt on the promise of heroic protection so many times, that the architecture of their desperation was practically blueprinted. He read it like a business prospectus. Every unmet need was a contract. Every disaster was a market. Every moment the heroes couldn't be everywhere at once was a gap in the service delivery model that a better organized human institution could theoretically fill. The worst part, the detail that should make every viewer sit with genuine discomfort, is that the relief was real. The response times genuinely improved. The casualty projections genuinely dropped. The 60% reduction is not fabricated. It is not propaganda, though Lex's communications apparatus makes sure it functions as propaganda. It is a documented operational outcome produced by a system that Lex built to do exactly what it claimed to do, while also doing several other things that took 9 months, 1 paralegal and 3 street-level heroes working without ins. Titutional support to find and name. The system helped people. The system was designed to control them. Those two facts lived inside the same architecture, and separating them will occupy Marvel's political institutions for years after the man himself is in custody. He designed it that way. He designed the inseparability deliberately. That is the most elegant cruelty in the entire operation. In a universe full of gods, the most dangerous man is still a billionaire with a microphone and enough patience to let the world talk itself into needing him. By the time the heroes realize this isn't a takeover, it's a referendum, half the world is already calling Lex Luthor humanity's last sane leader. And the worst part? For a long, credible, frightening while, he looked right. This is the story of how that happened. And if you've ever wondered why the most sophisticated threats in history never trip the alarm, it's because they are the alarm company. Stay with me. We're just getting started. Lex Luthor did not choose the Marvel Universe randomly. He chose it the way a structural engineer chooses a building to stress test, by identifying the one whose load-bearing walls have been quietly cracking for decades while everyone inside kept repainting the ceiling. Marvel's world is not weak. It is extraordinarily, spectacularly capable of absorbing violent external threats, alien fleets, rogue AI, interdimensional invasions, resurrected Nazi organizations hidden inside democratic institutions for 70 years. Marvel has survived all of it, repeatedly, with a combination of extraordinary individual heroism and remarkable institutional resilience that would be genuinely inspiring if it weren't also, examined closely, a portrait of a civilization held together by the specific availability of specific extraordinary people at specific crucial moments. That last sentence is not a celebration. That last sentence is Lex Luthor's entire business plan, written in one breath. The building is magnificent. The foundation has been quietly cracking since the first Chitauri soldier came through the portal. He read the structural report. He knew exactly where to push. Start with what Lex actually is. Not the comic book shorthand, not the cinematic reduction, but the full operational profile of what walks into Marvel's world that Tuesday morning. He is an industrialist with a logistics network that spans 12 countries and a procurement chain sophisticated enough to pre-position reconstruction materials in a disaster zone before the emergency declaration is officially filed. He is a political operator who has run successful Senate campaigns, defeated federal investigations, and navigated 3 separate congressional hearings without producing a single document that could be subpoenaed effectively. He is a PR tactician who understands media cycles the way Tony Stark understands engineering, intuitively, structurally, with the ability to see 3 moves ahead of where the narrative currently is. He is a technological opportunist who doesn't need to invent the best technology. He needs to acquire it at the precise moment when the inventor is vulnerable and the patent is undervalued. And beneath all of this, driving all of this, is a narcissism so refined and so disciplined that it barely registers as narcissism at all. He genuinely believes he is the most qualified human alive to lead civilization into its next era. The horror is that in the right context, he can make a compelling case. Marvel is the right context. Now look at the corporate landscape Lex steps into, because this is where the ecosystem recognition happens. The moment where a new organism enters an environment and realizes the niche it evolved to fill already exists, vacant, waiting. Stark Industries, Oscorp, Roxxon Energy, Advanced Idea Mechanics, Hammer Industries, the Weapon X program's procurement trail, A dozen defense contractors and biotech firms operating in the permanent emergency economy of a world that has been invaded 6 times in a decade. Marvel's scientific arms race is not a bug. It is a feature, normalized over years of superhuman conflict into the background radiation of daily institutional life. The concept of a brilliant, wealthy private individual with a personal defense apparatus and significant government contracts is not alarming in this universe. It is practically a recurring character type. It has a professional association. It has a lobbying presence. When Lex steps into this ecosystem, he doesn't look like an alien element. He looks like the next logical iteration of something that already has 3 floors of office space in the Capitol building. Then consider the political undercurrent. The one that has been running beneath every major Marvel political development for as long as the Avengers have existed. The Sokovia Accords were not an accident. They were a symptom of something much older, a world that had been saved so many times, at such enormous and undeniable cost, by individuals who answered to no democratic mandate, that the instinct to regulate them had become permanent political furniture. Every major superhuman conflict left a scar, not just in the physical infrastructure, but in the public imagination. The heroes always arrived. The heroes usually won. The cleanup always fell to someone else, to governments operating outside their budget, to communities whose insurance systems weren't designed for Leviathan impacts, to emergency services whose protocols hadn't been updated to account for gamma radiation in the debris field. The heroes were extraordinary, and the heroes were also, functionally, a permanent, unfunded liability. Lex reads that liability like a balance sheet. Every unfunded liability is an opportunity for someone willing to provide the funding. Here is the detail that separates Lex from every previous Marvel antagonist who tried to exploit institutional vulnerability. He doesn't create the trauma. This is the crucial distinction. Hydra created trauma. Ultron created trauma. Thanos created trauma on a cosmic scale. They generated the fear they then tried to manipulate, which meant the fear was always traceable back to them, always usable as evidence against them, always convertible into public motivation for heroic opposition. Lex finds fear that already exists, fear accumulated across a decade of alien invasions and superhuman collateral damage, and the specific background anxiety of living in a city whose skyline includes both Stark Tower and a permanent SHIELD surveillance satellite. He doesn't generate that fear. He validates it, he gives it language, he builds infrastructure around it, he makes it productive in the institutional sense, makes it into something that generates emergency management contracts and legislative consultations and public approval ratings, rather than trying to eliminate it in the heroic sense. The heroes know how to fight a threat that creates fear. They have no protocol for a threat that makes fear governable. Marvel's media landscape accelerates everything because it is volatile in precisely the ways that compound Lex's advantages. The Daily Bugle spent years turning Spider-Man into a public menace with nothing but headlines and editorial choices. No evidence, no documented crimes, just the sustained application of editorial framing to a complicated situation. Public opinion in Marvel is not a reflection of reality. It is a manufactured product, and the manufacturing process is accessible to anyone with the distribution capability and the message discipline to operate it consistently. Lex has both. In his own universe, he mastered the art of occupying the rational center of a debate while quietly engineering both extremes, funding the opposition to the opposition, owning the moderate ground by making the alternatives look unstable. In Marvel's media environment, where the heroes have never fully controlled their own narrative and have always been dependent on the goodwill of outlets they don't own, that mastery is not just an advantage. It is a structural override. He doesn't need to buy the Daily Bugle. He just needs to be the only person speaking in complete, measured sentences while everyone around him is either defending themselves or explaining collateral damage. The fatigue is the final piece, and it is the piece that transforms all the others from advantages into something close to inevitability. Ordinary people in Marvel's world are tired in a way that the heroic narrative rarely stops long enough to fully register. Not ungrateful. Exhausted. Exhausted in the deep, systemic, cellular way that comes from living in a city whose evacuation routes are memorized, whose children practice alien incursion drills, whose property values factor in proximity to known superhuman conflict zones. The heroic model asks a great deal of ordinary people, It asks them to absorb the collateral damage, trust the cleanup process, believe in the next recovery, and repeat. It asks them to do this indefinitely, with no guarantee that the next incident will be the last, with no institutional framework that would reduce their dependence on the availability of specific extraordinary individuals. When someone arrives offering not just money, but a system, a human-run, human-managed, democratically chartered alternative to the lottery of hoping the right hero is close enough, that exhaustion becomes the most fertile ground imaginable. Lex Luthor does not plant seeds. He steps into a field that was already tilled by a decade of incidents nobody fully recovered from. He didn't need to build Marvel's vulnerability, he just needed to read the structural report, identify the load-bearing crack, and position himself on the correct side of it before anyone else thought to check. The building was always going to need someone to repair that crack. Lex simply made sure he was holding the tools when it opened wide enough to see. Watch the first 90 days carefully. Not because they are dramatic, they are almost aggressively undramatic, which is precisely the point, but because every move in those 90 days is a foundation stone, and foundation stones look like nothing until the building is standing on top of them and you try to remove one. Day 1, the reconstruction pledge. Day 3, LexCorp logistics teams arrive on site, pre-positioned, already operational, moving faster than the municipal emergency management framework has even finished its damage assessment. Day 11, the first infrastructure management contract, transitioning construction personnel into long-term site management roles under a subsidiary charter that is publicly filed, legally registered, and written in language so technically dense that the relevant oversight, a committee will not finish reading it before the contract auto-renews. Day 30, the first sensor network goes live, officially designated for construction site structural integrity monitoring, quietly upgraded with capabilities that the official designation does not cover, and that nobody with the authority to ask about them has yet thought to ask about. 90 days, no crimes, no dramatic reveals, just sequencing. The specific, patient, architectural sequencing of a man who has done this before and knows that the foundation has to be invisible before the building can be load-bearing. His public messaging in this phase is a masterwork of strategic positioning, and it deserves examination the way you examine a very good piece of engineering. With respect for the precision, and with the specific chill that comes from understanding exactly what the precision is for. He never attacks heroes directly. That is the move of someone who wants a fight, and Lex does not want a fight. He wants a framework. So he talks about systems. He gives long, thoughtful interviews, unhurried, intellectually generous, visually calm, in which he expresses genuine admiration for the courage of enhanced individuals while raising carefully framed questions about the absence of civilian infrastructure beneath the heroic response model. He coins a phrase that the media adopts within 72 hours because it does exactly what a good phrase is supposed to do. It names something that already exists and makes the naming feel like a discovery. Superhuman dependency syndrome. The tendency of modern urban planning to assume an extraordinary individual will always arrive in time, rather than building baseline resilience into the city itself. It sounds like policy analysis. It functions like a slow saw cutting through the public's unconditional trust in people who wear capes, one reasonable sentence at a time, in the specific register of someone who is not against the heroes, but is thoughtfully, responsibly, painfully concerned about over-reliance on them. The tone is everything. The tone is the weapon. Tony Stark watches one of these interviews from a conference room on the 43rd floor of Stark Tower and doesn't say anything for almost a full minute. Friday runs the linguistic analysis, checks for manipulative framing patterns, adversarial rhetoric signatures, the specific verbal tells of someone constructing a false argument, and returns a result that Tony reads twice and then minimizes without responding to. The result is not that the argument is false. The result is that the argument is constructed, assembled with the precision of someone who knows exactly which words activate which responses in which demographic segments, deployed in the sequence most likely to produce maximum credibility with minimum verifiability. It is, technically, the most sophisticated communications operation Tony has encountered outside of his own PR team. He calls Pepper. He says, "We have a problem that isn't a problem yet, and I don't know how to explain that to anyone without sounding paranoid." Pepper, who has been running communications for Stark Industries long enough to recognize a narrative siege when she sees one beginning, says, "I know. I've been watching it for 2 weeks." Tony stares at the muted screen where Lex is still speaking, calm and measured and completely, infuriatingly reasonable. He says nothing. That silence is the most honest assessment he has given of the situation so far. The heroes fracture along exactly the lines Lex anticipated, and the fracture pattern tells you everything about how well he studied the terrain before he tapped onto it. Steve Rogers feels it first, not analytically but morally, in the way his particular gift for recognizing manipulation operates below the threshold of articulable evidence. He knows something is wrong the way you know a room has been searched when nothing is visibly out of place, but when he tries to articulate it, what he has is instinct without documentation, and instinct without documentation in the current political climate. In the post-Accords environment where every hero action is scrutinized for evidence of the unaccountable vigilantism that Lex's interviews are now systematically reframing as a civilizational risk, is not a resource. It is a liability. Moving against a private citizen who has committed no documentable crime, based on moral instinct, is exactly the story that Lex's communications apparatus has been preloading a response to since week 2. Steve knows this. Lex knew Steve would know this. The trap is not the situation. The trap is Steve's own integrity, weaponized against him by someone who understood it better than Steve expected to be understood. The mutant community's alarm arrives with the specific cold clarity of people whose threat recognition has been calibrated by survival rather than intelligence briefings. Hank McCoy identifies the scanning architecture's capabilities in month 3. He doesn't need the full technical specification. He needs 3 data points and a pattern, and he has 17. He produces a 40-page analysis documenting the biometric scanning subsystem's capacity to flag genetic markers associated with the X gene in 91% of controlled test cases, cross-referenced against operational specs of 3 comparable surveillance systems from Marvel's recent history. He presents it to 2 government bodies and 1 NGO. The responses he receives are careful, professionally courteous, and uniformly non-committal. Variations on the observation that, without evidence of active discriminatory deployment, technical capability alone does not constitute sufficient basis for regulatory intervention. He asks what level of documented evidence would be sufficient. The answers are carefully non-specific. He files the analysis. He updates it monthly. The scanning continues. Aurora Monroe reads the same intelligence differently, not through 40 pages of methodology, but through the immediate bone-deep recognition of someone who has seen this blueprint before, in cruder materials, deployed with less sophistication, against her community, repeatedly, across a lifetime. She begins moving the most vulnerable people away from the scanning zones, quietly, practically, without announcement. The way communities who have survived by being prepared for the worst move before the worst officially arrives. Now step all the way down, from the policy rooms and the intelligence briefings, all the way down to street level, because that is where the human cost of Phase 1 becomes something you feel rather than understand. You are a paramedic working a night shift in a district rebuilt under LexCorp's program. The streets are genuinely cleaner. The response infrastructure is genuinely faster. When you radio for backup, the routing system gets you there 2 minutes ahead of the old timeline, and 2 minutes is not an abstraction when you are holding someone's hand in a burning building. You are better at your job than you were 18 months ago, and the improvement is real, and you are grateful for it in the uncomplicated way that people are grateful for things that save lives. But there are checkpoints at 3 intersections that weren't there before. The scanner at those checkpoints were installed for structural integrity monitoring of rebuilt roadways. You have watched them flag 4 people in the last 3 weeks for reasons the system logs as anomalous biometric variants. You don't know what happened to those 4 people after they were flagged. The system routed them to a civilian coordination center, and they didn't come back to the neighborhood. You want to ask questions. You're not sure who to ask. You're not sure the asking wouldn't cost you the job. So you drive. You respond to the call. The streets are cleaner than they were. That is true. You are not wrong about that. That is what makes the silence so hard to break. The first undeniable, publicly documented win arrives in month 4, and it arrives with the timing and staging of something that has been prepared for, not manufactured. The event is real, the attack is real, the grid failure is real, but prepared for, in the way that a contractor who helped design a building's weak points is uniquely prepared to respond when those points fail. A coordinated infrastructure attack targets power across a major metropolitan corridor. Municipal response, 16 minutes. Shield, delayed, wrong hemisphere. The Avengers, mid-mission, diverted. LexCorp's Civilian Infrastructure Protection Division activates in 90 seconds. Drone networks reroute power through backup microgrids installed during the reconstruction phase. AI triage directs emergency personnel with a precision that the post-incident analysis will credit with a 60% reduction in casualty count versus unmanaged projections. When the cameras arrive, and they arrive quickly because the media partnership that Lex finalized in month 2 ensures that they find him in the command center in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking tired in the specific way that bypasses all ideological filter. Essen goes directly to the part of the brain that has been scared since childhood and wants to believe that someone competent is in charge. He doesn't perform relief, he performs work, and the performance of work in a moment of crisis is the most powerful image in the political vocabulary of a traumatized population. His approval rating jumps 14 points in a single news cycle. The headline writes itself. When the heroes couldn't make it in time, one man's system did. Tony reads it. Steve reads it. 3 Senate committee chairs read it and begin drafting consultation requests to LexCorp's policy division before the morning briefing is finished. The Avengers calculate their response with the specific paralysis of people who have been expertly maneuvered into a position where every available move validates their opponent's argument. Attack him. Confirm the narrative of unaccountable superhumans threatening elected order. Ignore him. Let the approval rating calcify into institutional legitimacy. Defend themselves. Look defensive, which in the current media environment is functionally equivalent to looking guilty. The trap is not the attack. The trap is the 60% casualty reduction that is real, documented, and being cited in legislative chambers by people who were elected on platforms of exactly this kind of accountability. The Avengers are still thinking about this like politics. They haven't understood yet that Lex finished the political phase 30 days ago. What they are looking at now is infrastructure. And infrastructure, unlike politics, doesn't change when the vote goes the other way. There is a specific moment in every Lex Luthor operation where the nature of what he is doing shifts from visible to structural, where the individual moves stop being things you can point to on a map and start being things embedded in the way the map itself is drawn. In Marvel's universe, that moment arrives somewhere between month 5 and month 7, without announcement, without spectacle, without thus, a kind of dramatic pivot that threat detection systems are calibrated to register. It arrives as a series of small, individually justifiable decisions that only reveal their pattern from altitude. A procurement contract here, a legislative consultation there, a quietly circulating policy framework document authored by a LexCorp subsidiary that never explicitly bears his name. Each decision is defensible in isolation. Each decision is a load-bearing component of something that, assembled completely, represents the most comprehensive private institutional capture in Marvel's political history. The genius is that you cannot point to the moment it became dangerous, because it was designed specifically so that moment would never be locatable. By the time you have the altitude to see the full shape, the shape is already holding up the ceiling, and you cannot remove a ceiling support without bringing down everything above it. The Stark-Luthor mirror war begins not with a confrontation, but with a documentary, produced by an independent studio, funded through 4 degrees of financial separation from anything bearing Lex's name, distributed through 3 media partners who each received LexCorp infrastructure contracts in the previous fiscal quarter. The documentary is called The Privatization of Safety, and it is, by any reasonable journalistic standard, excellent. Its methodology is rigorous. Its interviews are balanced. Its central argument, that the normalization of private superhuman defense infrastructure creates accountability gaps that democratic institutions are not equipped to close, is a legitimate critique that policy scholars have been making for years without this kind of production budget or distribution reach. It is also, dissected carefully, a 64-minute systematic dismantling of Tony Stark's public credibility, constructed entirely from documented facts stripped of the context that makes those facts understandable rather than damning. The weapons manufacturing history, the palladium poisoning period, the unilateral nuclear decision during the first Chitauri attack, the years of operating a private military capability under personal discretion with a charm offensive as the primary accountability mechanism. Every fact is real. Every omission is surgical. Tony watches it in 40 minutes and then sits very still for a long time. Because the thing about being attacked with your own history is that you cannot argue with the evidence. You can only argue with the framing, and arguing with the framing sounds exactly like what someone guilty of the underlying facts would do. Here is what makes Lex genuinely different from every other Tony Stark antagonist who has tried this approach. He doesn't want Tony destroyed. Destruction is simple and final and creates a martyr. What Lex wants is something far more operationally useful. He wants Tony discredited but functional, credible enough that opposing Lex still looks self-interested, damaged enough that his opposition cannot generate the public consensus needed to act on it decisively. He targets not Stark's technology or Stark's company but Stark's permission structure. The accumulated public goodwill that allows a private individual to operate a personal military capability and face minimal democratic scrutiny because the heroism has purchased enough cultural credit to insulate the capability from the harder questions. Lex is not draining Stark Industries' bank account. He is draining the trust account, slowly, methodically, with the patience of someone who understands that trust accounts, unlike financial ones, cannot be replenished quickly once the withdrawals start generating compound interest. Tony knows this is happening. Knowing does not stop it. That gap between knowing and stopping is where Lex lives, and he has furnished it very comfortably. The Muse. Tant question is where Lex demonstrates the most chilling strategic discipline in the entire operation, because here he plays a longer game than almost any observer credits him for. A game so long and so precisely calibrated that its endgame is invisible until it is nearly complete. His public position on mutants is carefully, deliberately, almost aggressively moderate. He funds 2 genuine mutant advocacy organizations with real community ties and measurable programmatic impact. He speaks in Senate hearings about the contributions of enhanced individuals to disaster response with the specific warmth of someone who wants to be quoted positively in the next Xavier Institute newsletter. He hires 3 mutant employees in visible senior positions at LexCorp's public-facing divisions and makes sure the hiring is covered in the right outlets. And simultaneously, in the regulatory appendices of an emergency preparedness framework being fast-tracked through 2 legislative chambers, subsection 7.4 contains a clause requiring biometric registration of individuals exhibiting spontaneous biological threat vectors during declared emergency periods. Written in language so technical, it requires a specialist to identify it as what it is. The skeleton of a mutant registry, built from legally defensible materials, waiting for a crisis to give it flesh. He builds the cage and calls it preparedness. He funds the advocacy and calls it good faith. Both things exist simultaneously in the same operational architecture. That simultaneity is not a contradiction, it is the mechanism. Step down to street level again, because the abstract only becomes real when it has a body. You are an EMT in a neighborhood that Lex rebuilt. You are also, in a way nobody in your station house knows, someone whose genetic profile would trigger a flag in the scanner at the intersection 2 blocks from your AP. Artment if you walked through it between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. when the sensitivity parameters are set to their highest calibration. You don't know this. Nobody has told you this. The scanner was installed for structural integrity monitoring. The sensitivity parameters are set by an algorithm whose calibration specifications are proprietary to a LexCorp subsidiary operating under a non-disclosure agreement with the municipal government. You walk through that intersection every night on your way home from shift. The scanner reads you and generates a log entry, classified as low-priority anomaly, that sits in a database you have never been told exists. The log entries are accumulating. There is a threshold. When the threshold is crossed, the system generates a routing recommendation to a civilian coordination center. You are currently at 73% of threshold. You work the night shift 4 days a week. The math resolves in approximately 6 weeks. You don't know any of this. You go home, you sleep. The city is cleaner than it was. The Doom branch is the most explosive speculative scenario in this entire operation, and it deserves the full examination it has been building toward, because the Luthor-Doom dynamic is not a rivalry between enemies. It is a collision between two versions of the same fundamental conviction, expressed through completely incompatible frameworks, meeting in a universe neither of them was designed for. Victor von Doom believes in sovereignty. Absolute, embodied, territorially grounded, mystically authenticated sovereignty, the kind that requires a castle and a nation-state and a face that the world recognizes as the face of its own legitimate authority. Lex believes in architecture, distributed, institutional, post-national architecture, the kind that requires no castle because it is embedded in the regulatory frameworks of every city that signed an emergency management contract with one of his subsidiaries. Doom wants to be the ruler of everything. Lex wants to be indistinguishable from the infrastructure of everything. These are not compatible goals. They are also, in the short term, potentially complementary ones, which is the specific window that Lex identifies and moves to exploit with the precision of someone who has been modeling the Doom variable since before he crossed universes. He approaches Doom not as a subordinate. Doom would end the meeting immediately. And not as an equal, which would be a lie they both understand too well. He approaches him as a peer consultant, which is the one framing that Doom's pride might tolerate for long enough to be useful. The alliance lasts exactly as long as it takes Lex to extract Latveria's technological isolation capabilities and political buffer value from the arrangement. Doom ends it before Lex does, which is the one variable Lex miscalculated. He underestimated how quickly Doom would recognize the extraction for what it was. Doom does not retaliate immediately. He catalogs it. He will address it at a moment of his own choosing, which is the specific threat that keeps Lex's operational security team working nights. The Kingpin arrangement is simpler and dirtier and more immediately productive than the Doom situation because Wilson Fisk is a man whose entire operational model is built around the principle that every institution has a price and every infrastructure has a back channel, which makes him and Lex structurally fluent in the same language even though they are working toward incompatible ends. Fisk provides granular city-level penetration, neighborhood logistics, municipal corruption networks, the kind of block-by-block influence that no satellite can map and no algorithm can replicate. Lex provides capital, legal cover, and the specific protection that comes from association with someone whose public profile makes direct law enforcement action politically complicated. Ted. The arrangement is clean and cold and mutually useful, and Lex begins the operational planning for Fisk's dismantling approximately 48 hours after the first meeting because Fisk's data, the names, the loyalty maps, the corruption network topology, is worth substantially more than the man himself, and a man with Fisk's profile is always, eventually, a liability that generates more risk than value. Lex does not betray partners out of malice. He retires them out of efficiency. There is a distinction. It does not help Fisk, but Lex would want you to know there is a distinction. The hero coalition fractures in the specific, grinding, unglamorous way that is far more devastating than a dramatic split, because dramatic splits can be repaired with a dramatic reconciliation, and Marvel has plenty of those on file. What Lex produces is not a split. It is a persistent, unresolvable disagreement about threat classification, about whether what they are facing is a criminal enterprise requiring evidence before action, a political problem requiring coalition building before opposition, or an existential institutional threat requiring immediate intervention regardless of the legal framework. All three assessments are accurate. They are also mutually exclusive in terms of the response they generate, and Lex designed them to be simultaneously accurate and mutually exclusive because a coalition that cannot agree on what it is facing cannot agree on how to face it, and a coalition that cannot agree on how to face it generates exactly the public image of dysfunction and unaccountable chaos that his communications apparatus has been preloading as the dominant narrative for the last 4 months. The Avengers are not failing because they are weak. They are failing because they are being played by someone who studied them carefully enough to know that their greatest strength, their diversity of perspective, their genuine democracy of disagreement, is also, in the right adversarial context, their most exploitable vulnerability. By now, Marvel still had stronger heroes, but Lex never needed to beat the strongest hero. He only needed the world to stop trusting them on the same day it started trusting him. He is approximately 3 weeks away from that day, and the filing cabinet in the municipal office has never been opened. There is a threshold in every authoritarian project, not a dramatic one, not a moment marked by a speech or a declaration or a single visible act of force, but a quiet structural threshold, a point of no return that looks from the inside exactly like any other Tuesday. The threshold is the moment when the system stops requiring its architect to make decisions and starts making them autonomously, when the incentives have been arranged so perfectly that every node in the network, every frightened city official, every algorithm, every contractor calculating their renewal terms arrives at the preferred conclusion independently, without instruction, without coercion, without anything that could be subpoenaed. Lex Luthor crosses that threshold in month 11. He is, at this moment, the most approved of non-governmental figure on the planet. He is also, technically, a private citizen with no formal authority over any public institution. Both of these things are true simultaneously. That simultaneous truth is the most dangerous sentence in this entire story. Read it again. Sit with it. Then understand that Lex designed it to be exactly that sentence, because a man with no formal authority over institutions he effectively controls is a man who has all of the leverage and none of the accountability, and that asymmetry, that specific deliberately engineered asymmetry, is the architecture he has been building towards since Dio. A1. The endgame surfaces not through a confession but through a document. It is titled, with the specific audacity of a man who knows the title will eventually be read in congressional testimony and wants it to sound reasonable when it is. A Coordinated Doctrine for Planetary Resilience, Human-Led Security Architecture for the Post-Superhuman Era. 312 pages, dense, technical, footnoted, written in the language that makes journalists summarize rather than quote, and legislators vote on summaries rather than text. Its opening thesis argues, with 70 pages of genuine statistical evidence, that Earth's current security model is structurally insolvent. Too dependent on individuals who cannot be democratically accountable, cannot be reliably deployed, cannot be replaced when lost, whose presence in conflict zones creates escalatory dynamics that cost civilian lives at rates that current emergency management frameworks are not designed to absorb. The proposed alternative is a centralized, AI-integrated, human-staffed planetary defense apparatus with unified command architecture. In the executive summary, Lex calls it civilization's next necessary step. In subsection 14.7, buried between two appendices about satellite relay infrastructure, the protocols include provisions for the indefinite detention of enhanced individuals assessed as uncoordinated threat variables during declared planetary emergency periods. The threshold for declaring a planetary emergency is broad enough to accommodate most of the last decade's major incidents. The document is being fast-tracked through 3 legislative chambers simultaneously. 2 governments have already announced accelerated implementation timelines. The window for opposition is closing the way all critical windows close, not with a dramatic slam, but with a quiet, bureaucratic, irreversible click. The heroes massas. They have to, but they move under conditions that Lex designed with the same precision he designed everything else. Conditions where every available action either validates his narrative or surrenders the field. Their evidence is substantial and not yet legally actionable in the jurisdictions that matter most. Their public credibility is at a cyclical low point, aided by a recent conflict whose collateral damage footage has been in rotation on Lex-affiliated media partners for 11 days. Their coalition is fractured along exactly the fault lines he spent a year carefully widening. And when they move publicly, visibly, with the urgency the situation demands, the communications apparatus that has been preloading its response for 4 months activates with the smooth efficiency of something that has been rehearsed. The framing is immediate and devastating in its simplicity. Unaccountable superhumans move to suppress civilian oversight legislation. 6 words. Technically accurate about the action, completely inverted about the meaning. The 6 words are on 47 screens within 90 minutes. Tony watches them and feels something he almost never feels, The specific, nauseating recognition of a man who builds things encountering a trap he should have seen being built and didn't, not because he lacks the intelligence, but because the construction was patient enough to stay below the threshold of urgency until urgency was no longer a useful response. The war room meeting happens because it has to happen, because at some point the two most dangerous human intellects in this scenario need to be in the same physical space, and Lex has been engineering the conditions for that meeting since month 3, when he identified it as the fulcrum on which the entire middle phase of the operation would turn. The room is underground. The screens show real-time deployment of Lex's emergency response network across 4 cities managing a simultaneous cascading infrastructure crisis. The casualty projections are dropping in real time, visibly, on screens that Tony cannot look away from because the numbers are real, and the people they represent are real, and the system producing those outcomes is the system he is here to oppose. Lex enters without theater. No dramatic timing, no staged entrance, just a man who knows the room is already arranged in his favor and doesn't need the additional punctuation. He walks Tony through the operational data with the patient precision of someone who has given this briefing many times and believes the content. Response time differentials, casualty reduction models, infrastructure resilience metrics comparing Lex protocol cities against conventional emergency management frameworks. The numbers are real. The system works. Tony knows the numbers are real. Lex knows Tony knows. That shared knowledge is the foundation of the conversation, and it is a foundation that Lex poured months ago. He makes the argument cleanly, without theatrics, without the megalomaniacal register that would give Tony something to push against. The heroes are extraordinary, he says, historically, irreplaceably. The world owes them a debt that cannot be calculated. But a civilization that requires heroes to survive is not a civilization. It is a permanent emergency. And permanent emergencies, without institutional architecture built to reduce and eventually eliminate the dependency, are fatal, not immediately, not dramatically, but through the accumulated cost of each successive crisis, each recovery that doesn't quite complete, each generation that grows up memorizing evacuation routes instead of being able to forget they exist. He is not the villain of this story, he says, with the precise calm of a man who has rehearsed the line so many times it no longer sounds rehearsed. He is the correction. The word lands in the room like something physical. The correction. Tony stares at him. The screens show the casualty projections still dropping. The system is still working. The numbers are still real. Tony's response is immediate, serious, and constructed with the intellectual precision of a man who has been preparing for this argument since month 2 while hoping it would never arrive. He does not deny the data. He cannot. And attempting to would concede the entire epistemological framework of the conversation to someone who has been more careful about evidence than anyone Tony has faced before. He attacks the architecture beneath the argument. The assumption that the problem is the heroes rather than the absence of a world that has learned not to generate constant catastrophic threat. He points to subsection 14.7. He points to the biometric registries. He points to the emergency detention protocols and the legislative frameworks concentrating crisis response authority in an unelected private apparatus with no democratic accountability and no succession plan that doesn't depend on Lex Luthor remaining alive and rational and uncorrupted by the absolute authority his own framework would confer. He asks the question that cuts deepest, the one question that Lex's 312-page document has no footnote for. Who watches the man who watches everyone else? The room is quiet. Even Lex is quiet for a specific measured beat that is itself a kind of answer. Then he says, "That's the first honest question you've asked since I arrived," the implication being that everything before it was performance. Tony stares at him and does not deny it, because denying it would be the performance continuing. That silence is the most honest moment in the conversation. Lex recognizes it as such. It is the only thing in the room that he did not engineer. Outside this room, Marvel's heavier architecture is finally activating, late, under bad conditions, with the specific disadvantage of entities designed to respond to large, clear, unmistakable threats, encountering a threat that has been carefully engineered to be small, ambiguous, and plausibly deniable at every stage of its development. The mystical detection apparatus registers something anomalous, not in any technology, not in any dimensional signature, but in the social fabric itself, in the way collective human belief and institutional trust have been redirected across 11 months in patterns that uncomfortably resemble the early signature of a reality-warping event. Except there is no magical component, no cosmic artifact, no supernatural trigger, just money and patience and an extraordinarily precise model of how frightened people make decisions, deployed with the consistency and discipline of a long-running engineering project. The universe's immune system wasn't built for this specific pathogen, and the detection delay is itself the most eloquent testimony to how completely outside normal threat parameters Lex operates. By the time the appropriate entities are certain enough to act, the operational timeline has already advanced past the phase where intervention prevents consequences. It can only manage them. The set piece detonates in slow motion across 72 hours. 3 coordinated infrastructure events separated by exactly enough time to read as escalation rather than coordination. A power grid collapse, a cyber attack on European defense communications, a mid-air near collision caused by navigation interference of the kind that only Lex's own infrastructure is positioned to detect and respond to in advance. He detects it. His system responds. The casualties are reduced. The emergency powers provisions in 4 legislative frameworks activate automatically, legally, mandatorily, as publicly voted upon by governments that 3 months ago believed they were approving disaster preparedness legislation. Within 72 hours, Lex Luthor's network holds more formally, legally sanctioned authority over critical infrastructure in 15 countries than any private entity has held in the history of modern governance. He has not seized power. He has been given it by systems built piece by piece to his specifications, by people who thought they were building something else. The distinction between seizure and gift matters enormously in the legal proceedings that will eventually follow. It matters much less to the people living inside the infrastructure tonight, checking their phones for updates, noting that the response times are fast and the streets are quiet and the system is working, and feeling, beneath the relief, something they cannot quite name but that sits in the chest like the specific weight of a door that has just locked from the outside. They could break Lex Luthor's machines. They could imprison the man, but proving he was wrong, with a world that was measurably safer inside his system than outside it, that was the problem nobody had a clean answer for. And Lex had known that since day one. He had built the 60% around it like a wall. The fall of Lex Luthor's command network takes 11 days. 11 days to dismantle something that took 11 months to build, which sounds like a victory until you understand what dismantle actually means in this context. Not remove, not erase, not restore to prior condition, but interrupt the most immediately dangerous consolidation while leaving approximately 63% of the underlying architecture fully operational under revised regulatory language. That 63% is not an accident. It is not an oversight. It is not the result of bureaucratic inefficiency or political cowardice, though both of those things contribute to it. It is the direct consequence of a design principle that Lex embedded in the operation before the first shell corporation was filed. The principle that the most durable infrastructure is infrastructure that works well enough that removing it causes more immediate pain than retaining it, and that the political will to accept immediate pain in exchange for long-term structural freedom is the rarest and most fragile resource in democratic governance. He built the 63% to be genuinely useful. He built it to hurt, to remove. He built it to survive him. On all 3 counts, the engineering holds. The thread that begins the unraveling is not pulled by a hero. It is not pulled by S.H.I.E.L.D. or by any of the intelligence apparatus that spent 11 months generating substantial but not yet actionable documentation. It is pulled by Carmen Torres, paralegal, state school law degree, public records database subscription that her firm nearly canceled twice for budget reasons, working a 70-hour week in a basement office in Lower Manhattan cross-referencing LexCorp's subsidiary filings against municipal emergency contract records, running a comparison that nobody thought to run because it requires simultaneously holding the corporate structure of a LexCorp 4th-tier subsidiary and the procurement language of a city infrastructure contract in a jurisdiction 3 states away. and noticing that the compliance certification language in one exactly mirrors the operational specification language in the other in a way that is statistically incompatible with independent drafting. The discrepancy is not a crime by itself, it is a thread. Carmen Torres recognizes it as a thread because Jessica Jones gave her the first layer of the corporate shell structure 9 months earlier, on a case that began as a missing persons inquiry and became something much larger without ever announcing the transition. She sits with the discrepancy for 3 hours. She calls nobody during those 3 hours. She runs 4 more comparisons. Each one confirms the same pattern. Then she picks up the phone. The hero's role in the 11 days is real and necessary and insufficient to produce the outcome alone, which is precisely why it succeeds, because an outcome that depends entirely on heroic intervention is an outcome that Lex has planned contingencies for, and an outcome that depends on a paralegal in a basement office and 7 months of unglamorous documentation work is an outcome that nobody's contingency planning accounts for. The physical protection of the investigation, shielding Carmen Torres and the evidence chain from LexCorp's legal apparatus when it moves to classify the relevant documents under emergency national security provisions, requires capabilities that street-level heroes and their particular skill sets provide in ways that cannot be replicated through conventional channels. The broadcast platform that gets the findings into public consciousness before the suppression mechanisms can fully engage requires the specific credibility that certain heroes carry in certain media environments. But the investigation itself, the documented evidence chain that makes everything else legally actionable, was built by people without capes and without press liaisons, over months that received no coverage and generated no approval ratings. That asymmetry between who built the case and who gets credited with the outcome is one of the most durable structural injustices of the post-Lex period, and it is one that the heroes themselves are, to their credit, more honed about than the institutional narrative that follows. Lex is arrested on a Wednesday morning. He walks from the vehicle to the building with the composed, unhurried bearing of a man attending a scheduled appointment. He does not look angry. He does not look defeated. He does not perform the particular theatrical deflation of a villain whose plan has been foiled because he does not experience what has happened as a foiling. He experiences it as a phase transition, the operational consolidation phase ending, the legal and political phase beginning, with the specific handoff of a project manager who has planned the transition in advance and believes the new phase is viable. His legal team files the first motion within 4 hours. 3 of the lawyers are graduates of institutions that received LexCorp endowments in the previous fiscal year. This is documented. It is not illegal. That combination, documented, not illegal, will be the defining texture of the legal proceedings that follow, repeated across 3 years of motions and hearings and appeals in a system that his own legislative influence has rendered measurably more complicated than it was before he arrived. He sits at the defense table and listens to arguments about his own architecture with the evaluative attention of an engineer reviewing construction documents. He makes notes. His handwriting is very small and very precise. The political aftermath is a landscape of damage so unevenly distributed that mapping it reads like an indictment of the recovery as much as the operation. The communities that paid first are the ones with the least institutional recourse, the neighborhoods where the scanning zones were densest, where the coordination center routings were most frequent, where the disappearances accumulated in case files that nobody with broadcast reach was covering. These communities receive, eventually, a government review process with a timeline measure, in years, and a scope that has been pre-negotiated to exclude the most politically inconvenient findings. The heroes who documented this damage most thoroughly, the street-level ones, the ones without towers, are the ones heard least urgently. They file their reports. The reports enter the system. The system processes them at its own pace. This is not a failure of heroism. It is a failure of infrastructure, of the specific institutional infrastructure that Lex spent 11 months making less responsive to exactly the kind of collective, unglamorous, non-spectacular action needed to address it. He did not create that gap. He widened it. He widened it deliberately. The widening holds long after the arrest. Tony Stark's reckoning is private and therefore more honest than anything he releases publicly. He sits with the knowledge that his name on a joint federal LexCorp security charter gave that charter credibility it would not otherwise have had. that his public hesitation to move early, motivated by the genuine and defensible concern that premature action would validate Lex's narrative, functioned as operational cover for a timeline that had been modeling his hesitation in advance. He does not process this quickly or cleanly. He processes it the way he processes every failure that implicates his own judgment rather than his technology, with the specific stubbornness of someone who needs to understand the mechanism before he can accept the outcome, which means taking apart the decision-making sequence at the level of individual choices and finding, in each individual choice, something that was reasonable given the available information and catastrophic given the information that was being withheld. Every step was defensible. The sequence was a trap. Both of these things are true. He sits with both of them for a long time. Then he starts building something new with different foundational assumptions about what threats look like and where they enter. The something new is the most important thing he builds in this period, and it is built in response to a man he could not out-invent because the battlefield was never the lab. What the governments do in the aftermath is the most honest data in the entire post-Lex dataset, because institutional self-interest, expressed without the modulating influence of heroic values or community accountability, is the clearest signal available about what the operation actually achieved at its deepest structural level. The public denunciations are loud, morally confident, and extensively covered. The administrative decisions are quiet, practically motivated, and largely uncovered. 63% of the operational infrastructure retained. Response networks, AI triage systems, emergency coordination frameworks, satellite monitoring architecture, all maintained under revised charters with new oversight language that has been legally reviewed and is publicly defensible. They retain it because it works. Because the response times are genuinely better. Because removing it would create gaps that existing budgets cannot fill. Because the thing Lex understood, the thing that made him more structurally dangerous than any villain who preceded him, is that the most durable form of power is not power you seize, but power you make yourself necessary to provide. He made his infrastructure necessary. The necessity survived his arrest. The governments that are loudest in their public condemnation are the same governments processing the quarterly operational extension of the systems he built in administrative layers that press releases do not reach, signed by officials who are not villains but are people with budget shortfalls and cities to run and recent memories of what the casualty projections looked like before. In the end, the most uncomfortable truth of the post-Lex period is not that thus, heroes failed. They did not fail. They stopped a specific and immediate consolidation of authoritarian control at significant cost and against serious opposition, and that matters enormously. The most uncomfortable truth is that stopping him and proving him wrong are not the same thing, and Marvel's world, with its real trauma and its real institutional failures and its real exhausted populations making real practical decisions about systems that genuinely improve their response times, does not yet have a clean answer for the second challenge. They stopped Lex Luthor. They did not stop what Lex Luthor argued. And in a universe where the trauma is real and the dependency is structural and the filing cabinet stays closed because opening it costs more than anyone has currently budgeted, that distinction is not a footnote. It is the next chapter. It is always the next chapter. The most dangerous thing Lex Luthor did in the Marvel Universe was not the biometric registries. It was not the legislative appendices or the emergency detention protocols or the systematic dismantling of Tony Stark's permission structure one documented fact at a time. The most dangerous thing he did was demonstrate that it was possible, that a single human being operating without superpowers, without an army, without a cosmic artifact or a divine mandate or a government commission, could walk into the most heavily defended, most superhero-saturated, most institutionally resilient universe in fiction and come within 11 days of permanent structural control. He demonstrated the method. He field-tested the architecture. He proved the proof of concept in the most comprehensive operational trial the concept had ever received. And the Marvel Universe, unlike a laboratory, does not seal its results behind a security clearance when the experiment concludes. The results are observable. The results are documented. The results are, for anyone paying the right kind of attention in the right kind of analytical register, a detailed operational manual for the next attempt. Lex Luthor was arrested on a Wednesday morning. By Thursday, 3 people were already taking notes. By the following Tuesday, the notes were being cross-referenced against the post-incident analysis documents that SHIELD released under a Freedom of Information request that nobody expected to be granted, and that was granted anyway, because the legislative framework governing classification thresholds had been quietly revised during month 8 of the operation by a policy subsidiary whose connection to LexCorp would not be fully documented for another 4 months. The first category of note-takers is the obvious one, and obvious threats in Marvel's world are almost reassuring in their familiarity. They have names, files, known operational signatures, established containment protocols. Norman Osborn watches the entire Lex operation from a position of furious, fascinated, specifically textured resentment that is the closest thing to genuine admiration his psychology can produce. He has been here before, has occupied the dark reign version of this same architectural ambition, has held the keys to a similar institutional consolidation, and lost them in ways that his own instability accelerated and his own spectacular tendencies made inevitable. He watches Lex with the focused attention of a student studying a superior execution of a curriculum he failed, cataloging what worked, cataloging what failed, running a revised model in his psychology with the specific efficiency of someone who has already made the early mistakes and carries them as operational data rather than personal shame. The difference between Osborn and Lex is granular but decisive. Osborn is less stable, more spectacular, more personally invested in the visible exercise of power rather than its invisible architecture. His version of this project will be louder, faster, more obviously villainous, and therefore more conventionally opposable. This is, from a certain angle, a relief. From another angle, the angle that understands that a louder, faster, more conventionally opposable version of this project will consume enormous heroic resources and institutional attention, leaving the quieter versions operating with reduced scrutiny. It is not a relief at all. It is a distraction. Lex would recognize it as one. He may have modeled it as one. The second category of note-takers is the one that produces the specific, settling dread that distinguishes genuine systemic threat from conventional villainy. They are not supervillains. They do not have aliases or files or known operational signatures or established containment protocols. They are policy analysts, corporate strategists, government officials, and academic researchers who watched the Lex operation with the evaluative, professionally detached interest of people whose job is to understand how systems are built and how they fail. Some draw the correct conclusions, spend the post-Lex period writing rigorous papers about institutional vulnerability and democratic resilience and the specific regulatory gaps that allowed the operation to proceed for 11 months without triggering actionable intervention. These people are valuable. Their papers will eventually inform meaningful reform in 2 or 3 jurisdictions over the next decade, which is better than nothing and slower than necessary. But others in this category, the ones who are more interested in the operational efficiency of what Lex built than in the democratic failures that allowed it, draw a different set of conclusions. They note the 63% retention rate. They note the genuine casualty reductions. They note the response time improvements that even the most rigorous post-incident critics cannot attribute to anything other than the systems Lex designed. And they ask themselves, quietly and professionally, whether the problem was the system or the man. Whether a better governed, more transparently chartered, more democratically accountable version of the same architecture might produce the benefits without generating the liabilities that eventually brought it down. This question is not evil. It is, in fact, the right question. The horror is that Lex designed his operation specifically to generate it, specifically to ensure that his arrest produced not closure, but a legitimate, ongoing, intellectually serious policy debate that would keep his architecture alive in the discourse long after his name stopped appearing in headlines. The street-level heroes see the copies before the intelligence apparatus does, because they work at the resolution where pattern recognition is a survival skill rather than an analytical exercise, where you develop the ability to read the shape of a threat from its early behavioral signatures because waiting for the full profile to develop is waiting too long. Daredevil detects it first in sound and absence, the specific frequency of a new corporate entity's drone network over Hell's Kitchen. The particular quality of silence at 3 intersections that recently had their monitoring infrastructure upgraded under a municipal contract whose procurement language he finds, in his civilian capacity as a lawyer, uncomfortably familiar. He brings the drone frequencies and the procurement language to Luke Cage, who has been mapping a similar expansion pattern across 3 other neighborhoods with the methodical patience of someone who learned long ago that the evidence has to be airtight before anyone with institutional authority will look at it. Seriously, they bring the combined documentation to Jessica Jones, who has been pulling a thread in a missing persons case that opened 6 weeks after Lex's arrest and shares a methodology, the shell corporations, the coordination center routings, the biometric flagging thresholds, with the cases she documented during the operation itself. The 3 of them sit in a room with a wall of documentation and feel the particular grinding exhaustion of people who are right again, who have the evidence again, who understand with complete clarity what they are looking at, and who will spend the next several months building a case that the institutional apparatus will take seriously only after the critical intervention window has significantly narrowed. They do not despair. Despair is a luxury unavailable to people who work at this resolution. They file the reports. They keep watching. They know exactly how this goes. They do it anyway. That specific choice, knowing the outcome, making the effort regardless, is the form of heroism that gets the least coverage and does the most work. The philosophical fracture inside the hero community deepens in the post-Lex period, along lines that were always present but are now undeniable, exposed the way structural cracks are exposed after a building survives an earthquake, not created by the stress but rendered visible by it in ways that cannot be unseen. The fundamental disagreement is not about Lex anymore. It is about what Lex revealed. The first position, held by figures whose moral clarity is their defining operational strength, argues that the lesson is the lesson of every authoritarian project across human history. Eternal vigilance, structural resistance, the principled refusal to allow beneficial outcomes to justify institutional capture, regardless of how genuine the benefits are or how compelling the efficiency argument has become. This position is correct. The second position, held by figures whose pragmatic effectiveness is their defining operational strength, argues that the lesson is the hero's own institutional inadequacy, that the vacuum Lex exploited was real and remains real, that a better designed and more accountable version of coordinated human-led crisis response infrastructure would have left no opening for his operation to enter through. This position is also correct. The tragedy is not that both positions are correct. Tragedy is normal in Marvel's world, and the heroes are experienced with it. The tragedy is that both positions being simultaneously correct produces a political paralysis that Lex specifically engineered, that his operation was designed to leave behind exactly this irresolvable disagreement, because an irresolvable disagreement about institutional architecture is the most reliable possible guarantee that the institutional architecture will not be fundamentally reformed, which means the vacuum will remain, which means the next operation will have the same entry point his did. What happens to the ordinary people, the ones who genuinely benefited from the infrastructure, whose lives were measurably improved, who lost someone to a coordinated attack, and remember with precision the fact that it was Lex's network that arrived in 90 seconds instead of 16 minutes, is the element of the aftermath that the clean victory narrative finds most resistant to incorporation, because it does not resolve cleanly into either vindication or condemnation. These people are not wrong. The benefit was real and documented and experienced in the irreducible physical reality of a person who is alive because a response system was faster than its predecessor. The fact that the same system contained a registry skeleton and detention protocols in its regulatory appendices does not retroactively eliminate the person who survived. Both things are true simultaneously. The system helped people and was designed to control them, and the people it helped are now being told by the same institutions that approved its installation that it was a mistake requiring partial removal, and that the partial removal will degrade some of the response capability they have come to depend on, and that this degradation is an acceptable cost for their long-term freedom. They are being asked to accept a present cost for a future benefit by institutions whose track record of delivering future benefits is, charitably, inconsistent. Some of them accept this, some of them don't. The ones who don't are not villains. They are not collaborators. They are people making rational decisions based on their direct experience of what the system actually did for them versus what the institutions that failed them before Lex arrived are promising to do for them now. They are the audience for the next person who figures out the method. Lex knew they would be. He built them into the architecture. Somewhere in this period, the exact location and timing remaining operationally unclear, a document begins circulating through channels that deal in the currency of influence without denomination. It is titled, with the specific audacity of someone who wants it found by exactly the people who should be most alarmed by it, Operational Lessons of the Luthor Initiative, a Practitioner's Analysis, 47 pages, devastatingly accurate. It identifies the 6 structural decisions that made the operation viable, the 4 tactical errors that accelerated its exposure, and, most importantly, the 3 modifications that would have extended the operational timeline by an estimated 14 to 22 months. S.H.I.E.L.D.'s digital forensics team spends 3 weeks on Provenance before concluding, with the quiet professional despair of people who recognize when they are being outmaneuvered by a document rather than a person, that the distribution was intentional, the untraceability was designed, and the content was seeded specifically to reach the people who found it through the methods they used to find it. The document is the payload. The payload has already been delivered. Somewhere in the gap between what S.H.I.E.L.D. can prove and what S.H.I.E.L.D. suspects, the next operation is already in its foundation phase, built by someone patient enough to read 47 pages and understand which 3 modifications matter most. The filing cabinet in the municipal office is still closed. The infrastructure is still running. The algorithm still rates new Shell Corporation filings low priority. The clock, without announcement or ceremony or anything that would trip the detection threshold, has started again. There is a specific kind of failure that history reserves exclusively for people who are correct before the consensus catches up with them. Not the failure of incompetence, not the failure of cowardice or moral collapse or insufficient effort. The failure of timing, of being positioned at precisely the right angle to see the full shape of a threat while every institution around you is still calibrating its instruments to detect a different kind of danger. This failure is particularly brutal in Marvel's world, where the threshold for moving against a private citizen has been set, deliberately, for good reasons, through hard experience, very high. Where the documented evidence standard exists because the alternative, heroes acting on instinct and pattern recognition against people who haven't yet committed publicly demonstrable crimes, has been weaponized before. Where the civil liberties, architecture that protects ordinary people from unaccountable superhuman intervention, is the same architecture that Lex Luthor spent 11 months using as a timing mechanism, counting down to the moment when the evidence threshold would be met and the intervention window would have already passed. Several people in Marvel's world figured out what Lex was doing early enough that it could have mattered. Their stories do not get the press conference. They get this chapter, which is the only honest accounting of what actually stopped him and how close it came to not being enough. Jessica Jones starts pulling the LexCorp thread in month 2. Not because she has a comprehensive threat model or a strategic briefing or any institutional support for the investigation. Because a woman whose name is Rosa Mendez hires her to find her son, Marcus, who was routed to a civilian coordination center during a routine emergency response activation in their neighborhood and has not been seen since. Jessica takes the case the way she takes every case, with the specific, unglamorous, client-focused professionalism of someone who learned long ago that the cases that don't make headlines are the ones that most need someone who shows up. She does not find Marcus in month 2. She finds the first layer of the corporate shell structure, a subsidiary, a subcontractor, a data management entity registered in a jurisdiction that specializes in regulatory opacity, with a compliance certification that matches, in language and structure, a LexCorp operational document she pulls from a public filing 3 states over. She documents it, she photographs it, she puts it in a folder and keeps pulling. She does not have a dramatic breakthrough moment. She has accumulating documentation and the specific patience of someone who knows that the truth in these cases is always several layers deeper than the first layer suggests, and that the only reliable tools for reaching it are time, stubbornness, and a public records database subscription that someone keeps almost canceling for budget reasons. The folder gets thicker. Marcus is still missing. She keeps working. 6 weeks later, Matt Murdock hears it. Not reads it, not analyzes it, hears it in the specific way that his gift translates the texture of daily urban life into information that no instrument except his own nervous system can collect. He hears it in the new quality of silence at certain intersections. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a specific electronic low-frequency monitoring hum at intervals that match no municipal maintenance schedule he can locate in public records. He hears it in the changed heartbeat patterns of people passing through certain blocks. Not the spike of sudden fear, but the lower, more sustained cortisol elevation of people who have learned to expect surveillance at specific coordinates and have normalized that expectation into their baseline biology. He hears it in conversations between city officials who have adopted, without apparent self-consciousness, a new operational vocabulary: variable coordination, spontaneous infrastructure events, biometric anomaly protocols. Borrowed, he recognizes from LexCorp operational documentation he has been reading in his civilian capacity as a lawyer reviewing municipal emergency management contracts for 3 community organizations that can't afford their own legal counsel. He brings what he has to the people positioned to act on it. He is told, not dismissively, not carelessly, but with genuine, constrained professionalism by people operating under real evidentiary standards, that what he has is suggestive and not yet actionable. He nods. He goes back to the city. He keeps listening. The hum continues at the intersections. The heartbeats stay elevated. The vocabulary keeps spreading through the municipal apparatus like a slow linguistic infection. He files it all. He waits for the layer that makes it actionable. H. He knows it exists. He has never doubted it exists. He is willing to keep listening until he finds it, which is a form of faith that does not require belief in anything supernatural. Only belief that the truth is always findable if you are patient enough and precise enough and willing to work at the resolution where the truth actually lives. Hank McCoy's contribution to the early warning effort is the most technically rigorous and the most institutionally ignored. And the gap between those two facts is itself one of the sharpest indictments of the post-Lex policy environment. In month 3, he produces a 40-page technical analysis documenting the biometric scanning subsystem's capacity to identify genetic markers associated with the X gene. Methodology section impeccable, cross-references comprehensive, confidence intervals conservative and explicitly stated. He presents it to 2 federal bodies and 1 international human rights organization. The responses are careful and professionally courteous and uniformly non-committal in the specific way of institutions that have been trained, through decades of mutant political conflict, to require an extremely high evidentiary threshold before taking any action that could be characterized as preemptive regulation of human security infrastructure based on the potential interests of a marginalized community. He asks what threshold would be sufficient. The answers are carefully non-specific. He files the analysis. He updates it monthly with new operational data. The scanning continues. He publishes an abbreviated version in a peer-reviewed journal, which is cited in 6 subsequent academic papers and 0 legislative hearings. He does not stop. He reduces his sleep to 5 hours a night and increases the update frequency to bi-weekly. The data becomes more precise. The political response remains non-specific. He keeps working with the specific disciplined fury of someone who understands that the only alternative to working is stopping, and that stopping is not available to him as an option while the scanners are running and the threshold is accumulating in databases that his community doesn't know exist. Aurora Monroe's response to the same intelligence is less analytical and more immediate, because her threat model is calibrated differently, not by inferior intelligence, but by superior experience, the specific, bone-level pattern recognition that comes from surviving decades inside the exact vulnerability that Lex's system is designed to exploit. She does not need 40 pages of methodology to recognize the architecture. She has seen variations of it deployed against her community in forms ranging from overt legislative persecution to the current version, which is the most sophisticated she has encountered and therefore the most dangerous, because sophistication in a system like this measures directly how long it can operate before the people inside it realize what it is. She makes a decision that the Institute debates afterward at length. She begins moving the most vulnerable community members away from the scanning zones before the scanning has been publicly confirmed as targeting, before the evidence threshold has been met. before anyone with institutional authority has acknowledged the threat. Quietly, practically, in the way communities who have survived by staying ahead of the documentation move when the pattern is clear even if the proof is still accumulating. This movement is later cited in the post-Lex investigation as evidence of the credibility of the early warnings. It is described in the public record as community resilience. She accepts that framing with the grace of someone who has learned that the accurate description of what her community does to survive is rarely the description it receives. The accurate description is intelligence work. The accurate description is that she was right 11 months before the paralegal found the thread, and the people who should have listened didn't, and her community paid part of the cost of that institutional failure with their bodies and their freedom and their continued presence inside the scanning zones while the evidence accumulated toward the threshold that would make the threat officially real. The street-level documentation effort is the operational backbone of the eventual case, and it is built across 11 months by people who are not doing it because they have been assigned to do it or because they have institutional support for doing it, or because anyone with the authority to act is currently listening. Luke Cage coordinates physical evidence gathering across 6 neighborhoods with the methodical patience of someone who has built cases in environments where the official channels were not reliably safe, and who knows that the difference between evidence that holds and evidence that doesn't is almost always in the collection methodology rather than the content. Sam Wilson maps the procurement chains connecting LexCorp subsidiaries to municipal infrastructure contracts, working in his civilian capacity with the non-classified access that is paradoxically more useful for this particular investigation than classified access would be, because the connection he is tracing is in the public record, deliberately placed there by someone who understood that putting things in the public record is the most effective way to make them invisible, since institutions are not designed to notice what they can see openly. They share their findings through channels kept deliberately off S.H.I.E.L.D.'s monitoring network. Not from fundamental distrust, but from the specific operational caution of people who found a LexCorp consulting contract in S.H.I.E.L.D.'s procurement records in month 3 and could not rule out compromised information security until the investigation was nearly complete. This caution is later vindicated in the most important possible way. Not by discovering the contract was covert, but by confirming it was legitimate, which means the caution was based on reasonable uncertainty, and the reasonable uncertainty was the right call. These are people who learned their protocols in environments where reasonable uncertainty was always the appropriate operating posture, and that learning is the difference between a case that holds and a case that gets classified before it reaches the stage where it can matter. Carmen Torres finds the discrepancy on a Tuesday evening in month 11, and she sits with it for 3 hours before calling anyone, and those 3 hours are worth examining because they are the 3 hours that the entire prior 11 months of work was building toward without knowing it was building toward them. She runs 4 verification comparisons during those 3 hours. Each one confirms the pattern. She is not excited. She is not triumphant. She is a person who has been following a thread for 9 months and has just found the point where the thread connects to something that can be pulled in a courtroom. And the feeling that produces is not celebration, but the specific, focused, almost physical click of a piece of evidence moving from suggestive to actionable. She picks up the phone and calls the number that Jessica Jones left her 9 months ago with the instruction to call when she found something that felt different from everything else. She has found something that feels different from everything else. The call lasts 4 minutes. Jessica says, "Don't move it, don't copy it yet, I'm coming to you." Carmen sits with the discrepancy on her screen and waits. Outside, the city hums with infrastructure that was built by a man who is currently filing a pre-trial motion in a jurisdiction whose regulatory language his own subsidiary drafted. The infrastructure processes its routines. The response times remain faster than pre-Lex baselines. The thread is real. The thread is finally long enough to pull from the right end. 9 months of a missing son's mother calling every week. 70 hours of a paralegal's week. The accumulated, unglamorous, institutionally unsupported patience of people working at the resolution where the truth actually lives. The truth was always there. It was waiting for someone patient enough and precise enough and angry enough at the right things to find it from the right angle. In a universe full of gods and cosmic events and world-ending threats, the thing that finally broke Lex Luthor's operation open was a compliance certification that didn't match its source documentation, found by a woman who almost didn't have access to the database that let her compare them. That is not an accident. That is the shape of how these things actually end. Not with a hero punch, but with a thread found late, pulled carefully, by someone whose name will not be on the press release, but whose 70-hour week is the reason the press release exists at all. Lex knew this was always the risk. He built his margins accordingly. His margin was 11 days. It was almost enough. Almost in this universe and in this kind of story is the word that means everything didn't end tonight. It does not mean everything is fine. It means the filing cabinet is finally open. What's inside it will take years to fully account for. The people who should have been listened to earlier are still waiting for that accounting. They will keep waiting. They will keep working while they wait. That is who they are. That is what this universe actually runs on, beneath the spectacle. Not gods, not armor. 70-hour weeks and public record subscriptions, and the specific refusal to stop pulling a thread just because the institutional apparatus isn't ready to hear where it leads. Every great villain, if they are truly great, functions as a mirror. Not because they are secretly right, not because their methods are justified by their outcomes or their insights redeem their architecture, but because the most efficient way to expose the structural weaknesses of a system is to exploit them. And exploitation, when it is thorough enough and sustained enough and documented carefully enough in the aftermath, becomes a form of involuntary diagnosis that no internal review process would ever produce on its own. The Chitauri invasion taught Marvel about the absence of coordinated planetary defense. The Hydra infiltration taught Marvel about the danger of building security architecture without democratic accountability. The Civil War taught Marvel about the catastrophic cost of unresolved tension between individual autonomy and institutional oversight. Lex Luthor's 11 months taught Marvel something that all of those lessons had circled without landing on. The thing that every previous villain, for all their different scales and methodologies, had not been patient enough or institutionally sophisticated enough to fully demonstrate. He taught Marvel that its deepest vulnerability was not military, not technological, not even political in the conventional sense. It was the gap between the world its heroes believed they were protecting and the world that actually existed beneath the surface of that protection. That gap is not a failure of heroism. It is a failure of honesty. The specific institutional dishonesty of a civilization that has been telling itself a recovery story for so long that the story has become load-bearing, and examining it honestly would require admitting that some of the weight is still there. The world the heroes believed they were protecting was a world in recovery, damaged but fundamentally oriented toward the values the heroes embodied, traumatized but resilient in the specific way that produces the kind of public trust that makes heroic intervention politically sustainable. That belief was earned. It was earned through genuine heroism across genuine crises, through specific moments where the public did choose freedom over security and accountability over efficiency and the uncertain protection of extraordinary individuals over the false safety of authoritarian order. The heroes had seen it. They had bet their lives on it and been right. But the belief had calcified, somewhere in the accumulated weight of crisis and recovery, into an assumption that the public's orientation toward heroic values was a fixed condition rather than a maintained one, a permanent feature of the landscape rather than a garden that required continuous tending. Lex Luthor did not invent the alternative to that assumption. He tested it, systematically with controlled variables and documented outcomes and the specific patience of a scientist who doesn't need the experiment to confirm his hypothesis because he has already modeled the result and is simply collecting the empirical record. The assumption, under systematic testing, proved less stable than the heroes believed. That instability is not their failure. The failure to anticipate it, to build institutions that would maintain the orientation rather than assuming its permanence, that is the failure that Lex diagnosed, and that Marvel's world is still deciding whether to treat. The specific insight that Lex demonstrated, the one that the post-Lex institutional analysis keeps circling and keeps struggling to translate into actionable reform, is about the relationship between fear and infrastructure in a permanently traumatized civilization. Marvel's heroic model has always operated on a particular theory of fear management. Identify the source, eliminate it with heroic force, allow public trust to recover through the observable fact of continued safety. Repeat. This model works. It has worked repeatedly across decades of Marvel history, producing genuine recoveries that are not fictional or propagandistic, but real improvements in real people's lives. What the model cannot account for is the specific threat profile of a villain who doesn't generate fear, but harvests it, who finds fear that already exists, accumulated in the public nervous system across a decade of invasions and incidents and recoveries that never quite fully completed, and who builds infrastructure around that fear rather than trying to remove it. The heroes know how to fight a threat that creates fear. They do not have a doctrine for a threat that makes fear governable. Lex was the first villain sophisticated enough to understand that distinction, and exploiting it required no superpower, no cosmic artifact, no army. It required only the patience to let the accumulated fear of a traumatized population do most of the architectural work while he focused on the regulatory framework. Tony Stark's contribution to the post-Lex analysis is the most technically rigorous and personally costly thing he produces in this period. A public post-incident engineering analysis formatted in the tradition of serious aerospace and defense institutions, with his name on it, examining how an operation of this scope was able to proceed for 11 months without triggering decisive institutional response. The document's central finding is architectural. Marvel's security infrastructure has been built layer by layer, crisis by crisis, on a foundational assumption that the primary threat vector is external and violent, which has produced extraordinary capability to detect, respond to, and recover from external violent threats while maintaining a structural blind spot for internal institutional capture executed through legitimate channels. The document is read widely, cited frequently in the policy literature that follows, and implemented in modified form across 2 jurisdictions in ways that preserve approximately 60% of its core recommendations. The remaining 40%, the accountability provisions, the oversight architecture, the democratic checks on private infrastructure authority, is modified during the legislative process in both cases in ways that expand operational scope while reducing the mechanisms for democratic course correction. Tony reviews the modifications and supports the legislation anyway, on the grounds that 60% of a meaningful reform framework produces more structural improvement than 0% of a perfect one. He makes this choice knowing someone will read it as comfort with the modifications. He is not comfortable with the modifications. He will spend the next 3 years working on the remaining 40% through channels that are slower and less visible than the initial legislative push. He does not stop. He is very tired. These 2 things coexist in him the way they coexist in everyone doing this kind of work. The tiredness and the not stopping, side by side, neither one canceling the other. What the X-Men carry forward from the Lex period is something older than the operation and more fundamental than its specific mechanics. The confirmation, if confirmation were still needed after everything, that the legal and institutional frameworks of Marvel's world are not neutral instruments that occasionally get captured by bad actors. They are contested spaces, continuously, perpetually, as a structural condition of their existence. Spaces where the question of whose safety counts, and whose fear registers, and whose documentation gets believed, and whose warnings get escalated is never finally resolved but only temporarily settled in ways that reflect the current distribution of institutional power rather than any permanent commitment to justice. The registration architecture that Lex embedded in the legislative appendices did not appear in a vacuum. It appeared in a world where registration of enhanced individuals had been proposed, debated, partially implemented, repealed, and reproposed in cycles spanning decades, where the question is never fully closed because the fear that generates it is never fully addressed, and the political incentives for exploiting it never fully disappear. Lex did not create the template. He refined it to its most legally durable form. And the refinement is so precise, so carefully located in the space between defensible and indefensible, that removing it requires not just political will, but a quality of sustained, coordinated, strategically sophisticated advocacy that the mutant community has been building for generations and will continue building long after Lex's name stops generating search results. They were doing this work before he arrived. They are doing it after he left. The work does not have a completion date, it has practitioners. That is how it survives. The philosophical question that the post-Lex period cannot resolve, and that was specifically designed to be unresolvable, is the legitimacy question embedded in the system's genuine benefits. This is Lex's most lasting intellectual contribution to Marvel's political landscape, and it is a contribution he made deliberately, with full understanding of its corrosive effect on the post-exposure consensus view. Ilding needed to dismantle what he built. He made the system work, not in every dimension, not in the dimensions involving surveillance and detention and registry architecture, but in the emergency response dimension that ordinary people experience most directly. The response times are genuinely better. The casualty projections are genuinely lower. And the political process of removing the harmful components while preserving the beneficial ones is not a technical challenge. It is a political challenge requiring exactly the kind of sustained cross-partisan, cross-community coalition that is hardest to maintain in the aftermath of a crisis that left different communities with different primary grievances and different immediate priorities. Lex understood that the difficulty of the post-exposure cleanup would be proportional to the genuine benefits he embedded in the system, and he designed those benefits to be as real and as difficult to replicate outside his framework as his engineering capability allowed. The system is hard to remove because it is genuinely useful. That is the most elegant cruelty in the entire operation, not the surveillance, not the registries, not the detention protocols. The 60% casualty reduction. Built-in, load-bearing, real, and designed to make the dismantling hurt more than the retaining. The debate that the post-Lex period generates, in policy chambers and community meetings and comment sections, and the specific informal conversations that happen between people who lived through it and are trying to figure out what they are supposed to think about what they lived through, is a debate about a question with no clean answer, designed specifically to have no clean answer. Was Lex Luthor exposing Marvel's institutional corruption or manufacturing it? The answer, arrived at by anyone willing to sit with the full documented record, without the comfort of a clean resolution, is both, in proportions that cannot be cleanly separated, and that inseparability is the point. He found real corruption and real institutional failure and real unaddressed fear and real unmet needs, and he addressed them with real solutions that were also infrastructure for control. And the real solutions and the infrastructure for control were not separable systems, but the same system, designed so that removing the control infrastructure degraded the solutions, and accepting the solutions meant accepting the control infrastructure. This is not a paradox that resolves with sufficient analysis. This is a policy trap that generates political conflict indefinitely, feeding the cycles of crisis and recovery that make Marvel's world perpetually hospitable to the next person who figures out the method. Each iteration more sophisticated than the last, each one leaving behind a slightly more complicated institutional landscape for the next heroes to navigate. He didn't just invade the Marvel universe. He installed a recursive argument in its institutional DNA, an argument that regenerates with every new crisis, that sounds more reasonable every time the heroes are unavailable, that accumulates evidence every time the public asks for safety and receives chaos instead. The most honest thing that can be said about what Lex Luthor taught Marvel about itself is this. He taught it that the heroic model, in its current form, contains a structural dependency that it has not found a way to address honestly. The model requires extraordinary voluntary sacrifice from specific individuals, relies on those individuals being available at precise moments, generates irreducible collateral damage, and does not produce the institutional resilience that would reduce the world's dependence on it over time. Institutional resilience, built deliberately, funded adequately, maintained through the unglamorous work of policy and governance and community investment, is not as spectacular as a last-minute heroic intervention. Spectacle is the currency that keeps the model funded and trusted and politically protected. Lex walked into that dependency and offered an alternative. The alternative was poisoned. The dependency is still there, and the dependency, unaddressed, is the advertisement for the next poisoned alternative. The heroes know this now. They are trying to answer it honestly, with policy and infrastructure and the unglamorous continuous labor of building systems that don't require extraordinary individuals to function. They are doing it imperfectly and incrementally, and against significant institutional resistance. The mirror Lex held up is uncomfortable. They are still staring into it. What they decide to do about what they see, that is the question this chapter cannot answer. That is the question the next chapter of Marvel's history will either answer or fail to. And the filing cabinet, somewhere in a municipal office in a city whose name doesn't matter, is finally open. What was inside it is being accounted for. The accounting is taking longer than it should. It always does. The heroes are still there. So is the problem. Both of those things, held simultaneously, is the most honest description of where Marvel's world stands after 11 months of Lex Luthor. Not defeated, not restored, not resolved. Changed. More honest about its own architecture than it was before. Whether that honesty produces reform or just more sophisticated self-deception is the question that has no predetermined answer. It has only the people choosing, one unglamorous decision at a time, which direction the answer goes. You want to know how this ends. You have been inside this story for 9 chapters. The shell corporations and the legislative appendices, the biometric scanners humming at intersections nobody thought to audit, the paralegal with the database subscripts, and the street-level heroes filing reports into systems that were not designed to receive them urgently. You have watched Lex Luthor build something inside a universe that was supposed to be too powerful, too heroic, too institutionally defended to be built inside of. You watched him get stopped. You watched the stopping fall short of the undoing. You watched the 63% retention rate and the filing cabinet and the man in the unnamed city opening a new document on a screen that no algorithm flagged as dangerous. You want to know if Marvel is okay. You want the clean ending, the restored world, the closed chapter, the specific narrative satisfaction of a finale that justifies the cost of arriving at it. The honest answer is no. The more honest answer is, that was never the right question. The right question is what the world looks like now in the specific, unglamorous, unresolved way that the world always looks after the crisis ends and the cameras leave and the people who actually live there have to keep living there. That question has an answer. It is not the answer you were promised at the beginning of this video. It is the only answer this story has earned the right to give you. Carmen Torres received a commendation from the State Bar Association 6 weeks after Lex's arrest. She attended the ceremony in the same clothes she wore to the office the Tuesday she found the discrepancy, because she had been working 70-hour weeks since then and had not prioritized anything else. She shook hands with the presenting official. She said thank you. She went back to the office. She is currently 4 months into a new case involving a mid-sized infrastructure management company that won 12 municipal service contracts in the 18 months following Lex's arrest. In cities whose emergency management frameworks were updated during the Lex period, under procurement language whose structural DNA she recognizes the way you recognize a face you have studied for a long time without ever meeting in person. She has found 2 layers of the corporate shell structure. She has not found the bottom. She does not expect to find it quickly. She expects to find it eventually, which is a different kind of confidence. Not the confidence of speed, but the confidence of method. The specific assurance of someone who knows the threat exists because she has found threads before and pulled them all the way to whatever they were attached to, regardless of how many layers stood between the surface and the connection. Her database subscription was renewed last month without a budget discussion. She did not ask why. She is grateful without needing the explanation. She opens the next filing. She keeps going. Jessica Jones found Marcus Mendez. This requires saying plainly, without irony, without the qualifications and the structural analysis and the post-incident framework that has surrounded everything else in this final accounting. Because in a story full of incomplete resolutions and recursive institutional failures and systems that outlast their architects, a mother called every week for 9 months and her son came home, and that fact deserves to stand without anything around it diminishing its weight. He had been held in a civilian coordination center operating under a LexCorp subsidiary charter in a jurisdiction the investigation did not prioritize until month 8. He is alive. He has been home for 6 months. His re-entry into the life he left has been complicated in the ways that 9 months of arbitrary detention complicates a life. the specific, unnamed difficulties that do not have a single clean diagnostic label, but that reshape the texture of ordinary days in ways that are felt more than articulated. He is working through it with the particular stubbornness of someone who decided, at some specific point during those 9 months, thus, that he was going to get out, and that getting out was not going to be the largest thing in his life. Some days that decision holds more easily than others. His mother calls every morning. Jessica Jones did not charge her for the case. She does not explain why. She takes the next case. She always takes the next case. The cases do not stop coming. That has never stopped her, and it is not going to start. Lex Luthor's trial begins in 4 months. The pre-trial proceedings have already generated more motions than any comparable prosecution in the jurisdiction's history. A volume that is itself a data point about how thoroughly his 11 months reshaped the legal landscape he is now being prosecuted within. 3 of the most significant charges have been reduced through procedural arguments, exploiting legislative ambiguities in emergency powers frameworks that his own policy subsidiaries helped draft. The prosecution is strong. The evidence is real, documented, and substantial in ways that took 11 months and one paralegal's 70-hour week to make legally actionable, and the strength of the case is directly proportional to the unglamorous difficulty of building it. The outcome is genuinely uncertain, not because the evidence is weak, but because the system that will adjudicate it is the system that was partially designed by the man it is adjudicating. And partial design is enough to introduce specific frictions at specific junctures that compound across a multi-year proceeding into something that looks, from the outside, like institutional delay, and looks, from the inside, like exactly the timing Lex modeled when he was building the legal architecture. He attends every hearing with the same composed, unhurried bearing. He sits at the defense table and listens to arguments about his own architecture, with the evaluative attention of an engineer reviewing construction documents. He makes notes in very small, very precise handwriting. He does not look like a man who has lost. He looks like a man who is in a different phase of a project that has more phases remaining. Tony Stark's post-Lex framework document has been cited in 14 legislative reform proposals across 9 jurisdictions. 2 have passed into law, preserving approximately 60% of the core recommendations. The remaining 40% was modified in both cases. Accountability provisions reduced, operational scope expanded, during legislative processes that Tony participated in and could not fully control, in a political environment that Lex's operation made measurably less hospitable to the kind of democratic accountability architecture that would have made his operation impossible in the first place. Tony supported the modified legislation. He made that choice knowing it would be read as endorsement of the modifications. The reading is not wrong. The endorsement does not reflect comfort. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The choice was pragmatic, and the pragmatism cost something, and the something is being worked on through slower channels that do not generate press releases. He is building the next version of his threat detection framework with foundational assumptions that did not exist in the previous version. Assumptions about what institutional capture looks like at the entry stage, about what shell corporation filing patterns precede the kind of infrastructure embedding that the previous system rated low priority, about what it means for a threat to be invisible not because it is hidden, but because it is formatted as something the detection system was not designed to classify as a threat. He is very tired. He has not stopped. The tiredness and the not stopping coexist in him the way they coexist in everyone doing this kind of work who has decided that stopping is not an option they are willing to take. The man in the unnamed city has been working for 7 months. His document has grown from a first-page draft into a comprehensive operational architecture. All 6 structural decisions from the Lex operation, all 4 modifications from the anonymous 47-page analysis, and 3 additional innovations that are entirely his own, derived from studying the post-Lex cleanup response, mapping the specific gaps in the new oversight frameworks, modeling the precise sequence of events that would allow a new operation to proceed for 25 to 30 months before generating the kind of documentable discrepancy that a paralegal with the right database subscription would be positioned to find. He is not Lex Luthor. He does not have Lex's resources, or Lex's public profile, or Lex's particular brand of narcissism that made recognition nearly as important as the project itself. A need for credit that was, in the end, an operational vulnerability as significant as any tactical error. He considers that need the primary design flaw he is eliminating from his own version. He does not want recognition. He does not want headlines or courtroom proceedings or a chapter in the retrospective analysis that gets written when it is finally over. He wants the infrastructure. He wants the dependency. He wants the specific, quiet, bureaucratically inevitable moment, 25 months from now, or 30, or 35, with the patient indifference of someone who decided the timeline was not the point. When the filing cabinets stay closed because the people who should open them have been made too resource-constrained and too institutionally isolated and too exhausted by the previous case to find the thread before it becomes load-bearing, he opens the first shell corporation filing. He selects the jurisdiction. The algorithm processes it. The algorithm rates it low priority. The clock begins again without announcement, without ceremony, without anything that would distinguish this Tuesday from the Tuesday before it. And Marvel's world keeps moving, keeps cycling through its crises and its recoveries, its spectacular heroic moments and its unglamorous institutional failures, its Tony Stark's publishing documents that get 60% implemented, and its Ororo Munro's moving communities before the worst arrives, and its Carmen Torres's finding discrepancies that took 9 months of someone else's patient groundwork to make findable. It keeps moving with the specific, unromantic momentum of a world that has survived every attempt to fundamentally alter its architecture and has been fundamentally altered by all of them simultaneously. More resilient and more compromised than it was before, more honest about its own structural vulnerabilities and more politically resistant to addressing them, containing within it both the people doing the work and the systems designed to make the work harder. Both the infrastructure that saves lives and the infrastructure that monitors them, both the heroes who were right too early and the institutions that made being right too early functionally identical to being wrong. This is the world Lex Luthor left standing, not destroyed, not liberated, not resolved into either the dystopia his critics feared or the civilization his document promised, just standing, more complicated, more self-aware, more honest about the gap between the heroic story it tells about itself and the institutional reality that story is asked to cover, in the specific way that things stand when they have been tested by something that knew exactly where to push and pushed precisely there for 11 months with the patience of someone who understood that the most durable damage is never the visible kind. In a universe of gods and monsters, Lex Luthor did not try to become the strongest. He tried to become necessary. He was stopped before he became permanent. He was not stopped before he became true. And the world he left standing, this world of quarterly audits and retained infrastructure and shell corporation filings rated low priority by algorithms calibrated for a different era's threats, carries his argument inside it the way a body carries a healed fracture, structurally sound, functionally normal and permanently different in the specific place where the break occurred, where the bone grew back slightly denser and slightly less flexible, and where, under the right conditions of stress applied at the right angle, the old line is still the line that fails first. The fracture is the argument that the heroic model is insufficient. The argument is not wrong. It is simply being made by the wrong people, toward the wrong ends, using the genuine inadequacy of the current system as the entry point for something that would replace inadequate heroism with adequate authoritarianism, and calling the replacement civilization, which is the most dangerous word in the entire operation, because civilization is what everyone is trying to protect. And a man who can credibly claim to be building it is a man who has found the one argument that bypasses every other defense. The heroes know this now. They are trying to answer it honestly. The answer requires building the thing that Lex exposed as absent: the institutional resilience, the democratic infrastructure, the human-run coordinated response architecture that doesn't require a Lex Luthor to build it or an extraordinary individual to sustain it. They are building it imperfectly, incrementally, against the resistance of institutions that Lex made harder to reform and the fatigue of people who have been surviving crises long enough. That preventing them feels abstract against the urgency of the next alarm. They are building it anyway. That has to count for something. In this universe, on this Tuesday, with this filing cabinet finally open, and this document in the unnamed city quietly growing, and this clock running again beneath the threshold of every detection system currently deployed, that has to be enough. The question of whether it is enough is the question that the comment section will fight about, and the policy analysis will model, And the street-level heroes will answer practically, one pulled thread at a time, one 70-hour week at a time, without waiting for the institutional consensus to catch up with what they already know. Drop your answer below. The man in the unnamed city is counting on there being one, so is everyone else. The difference is which side of the argument you're answering from.